Hi, this is a video summary of James chapters 3 through 5. So a little review for those of you who are watching this for class. James 3 is about the tongue primarily. The whole first part of James is about the tongue. And I always laugh when I read this chapter, although I suppose it's not funny. The tongue is such a crucial part of our body. If you think of the tongue as a metaphor for all kinds of human communication, then this chapter suddenly becomes about how humans interrelate to each other. Wars are started by the tongue. In a sense, all wars are started by some failing of the tongue, right? Maybe. I mean, sometimes people just want to start a war, and it doesn't matter what you say. But the tongue is such a central part of human sinfulness, to be honest. James starts off by saying, we all make mistakes. If you could control your tongue, now that's a perfect person. Now, of course, James doesn't equate mistakes with sin. I think this is important for me as a Wesleyan. James says in chapter 1 that temptation, when it's conceived, gives birth to sin. And so sinning with you would only sin with your tongue if you intentionally say something hurtful or harmful. Of course, there is unintentional sin, where you unintentionally harm someone you didn't intend to, but you said something. But anyway, a mistake is not a sin, is what I'm getting at here. Sometimes we say the wrong thing, but James, I think, doesn't have that so much in mind. I think James mostly in mind has when we lash out at someone, or we say something that's inappropriate, or we curse someone, as we see later on in the chapter. Well, controlling the tongue is extremely difficult. I didn't need to tell you that. We all know this. Now, of course, there are these people who are quiet people. There are people who I think are naturally quiet and reserved, and they don't have a trouble with lashing out. I don't think that's necessarily virtuous. It is virtuous, but it's not. If you're born that way, then I'm not sure you get as many credits for being able to control your tongue as if you control it and you'd like to talk a lot. But basically, controlling the tongue is extremely difficult. Some great descriptions of the tongue here. The tongue is a fire. It is set on fire by hell, by Gehenna. No one can tame the tongue. You can tame a lot of animals, but you can't tame the tongue. It is a restless evil, full of deadly poison. Again, not really funny, but this is true, right? We know this. People just decimate each other with their tongue. And of course, today that includes our fingers and social media and things like that. We harm each other so commonly and readily in the world. I was telling you all in class that when we were first trying to start the seminary, I had a 1-minute delay on my email, so that I had at least a minute to decide not to send something that I just hit send on. And sometimes I did stop it, and then other times I went ahead and took the minute off. But some of my friends suggested I should have a 5-minute delay on my email. But we have a tendency, not everybody, but a lot of us have a tendency just to say what comes into our mind, and we don't think about the consequences or how it might hurt others. And then sometimes we say something that's like, "Oh, pull it back, pull it back." Hopefully you'll experience that. If you don't, it suggests that you're not reflective enough about your speech, probably. But marriages fall apart because of poor communication. Sometimes it can take a long time to pull back bad comments that have been made. I've known marriages where 20 years on, and there's still comments made in the first year or two of marriage that are causing almost irreparable damage to the relationship. Again, that's wrong, because we have to forgive. But best is not to offend in the first place. And so again, there's nothing in this chapter that is difficult to understand. It's just difficult to do. And of course, I love this way of thinking of other people. Other people are made in the likeness of God. Why would we curse God? And so why would we curse somebody who's in the image of God? Now, I think probably James primarily has within the church in mind here, but we believe that all humans are made in the image of God. And so I think, as I've said in class, this suggests a certain respect for other people because they are made in the image of God. And I think I mentioned in class that even when someone has been a murderer, let's say, when they're dead and we bury them, we bury them. We don't throw them out into the woods for wild animals to eat them, because this is a person who, even though they were horrible, they were made in the image of God, and we bury them. That may be a bad example, but I believe that even the most heinous person is still represents the image of God or the likeness of God, and therefore we treat all people with some respect and dignity, even when we abandon them because they have become moved beyond redemption. Again, of course, we don't know so much when a person's moved beyond redemption as human beings. God knows when a person is no longer redeemable, but we don't know that. And so I think we need to go to the greatest of lengths to try to see the lost reclaimed. Well, James 3 continued. The second part of James talks about two different kinds of wisdom. Here's the new material for my class. We saw wisdom in chapter 1, right? Where we were talking about trials. James is talking about trials. And James says, if anyone lacks wisdom, let him ask of God, who gives freely to those who need it. And so that's heavenly wisdom, I assume, is what James is talking about in James 1. But here in James 3, we learn that there is earthly wisdom that is not really wisdom. And this earthly wisdom is earthly, it is soulish, it is devilish. The word for soul there is often translated unspiritual. It's a hard word to translate, to be honest. Worldly wisdom is earthly and devilish and soulish. In fact, he gives us a hint of what this earthly wisdom is. So this earthly wisdom is selfishly ambitious. It says, I'm going to get ahead even if I have to step on you. Or, ooh, you have something I like and I want it, and I'm going to take it from you if I can. That's worldly wisdom. It's earthly wisdom. Earthly. I kept thinking of the Sermon on the Mount. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. The world doesn't reward meek people. If you want to not advance in your company or organization, be meek. Meek people don't advance. It's the people, it's the squeaky wheel that gets the grease, as the expression goes. You need to be assertive. You have to promote yourself. It's a difficult thing because basically that's worldly thinking. This idea of promoting yourself and selfish ambition. Or I want what they have and I'm going to take it from them, or I'm going to find a way to deprive them of it. All of this is worldly thinking. This is earthly thinking. And so this worldly wisdom here reminds me of the last verse of chapter 1, which talks about true wisdom takes care of orphans and widows and is unstained by the world. And so this idea of being unstained by the world is the idea that we listen to the wisdom that is from above, the heavenly wisdom, not the earthly wisdom that is devilish and focuses on things like selfish ambition. What is the wisdom from above like? What is heavenly wisdom from above like? Well, heavenly wisdom is pure, it's peaceable, it's gentle, it's submissive. Now, there's not one that you hear promoted. We want to give you the submissive award for the year. Not a lot of awards for submissiveness given out. And of course, there are the dangers. The danger of submission is, of course, that sometimes we enable the abuser, and there's a whole discussion to have there. I don't think that this is, again, I'm trying to take biblical principles and balance out the proverbial. Proverbs are never, Proverbs generally aren't exceptionless. That is to say, Proverbs are generally true. Proverbs are not like philosophical propositions. Proverbs are true enough of the time to capture a piece of the truth. And so heavenly wisdom is submissive. But there are situations where, so for example, if a spouse is abused It does not help the abuser to let the abuser in a marriage continue to abuse. That doesn't. Now, again, I'm not saying to blow them away. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is to enable a relationship where a abuser or bully continues to oppress. I don't think that glorifies God. Of course, a lot of times we are stuck to some extent, or can be. So I want to be careful about this word submissive here, because this is not giving a green light to the bullies and the abusers and the tyrants of the world. However, I think probably most of us don't have a problem with over-submissiveness. There are Christians who have a problem with being too submissive, but I think probably for most of us the problem is that we're not submissive enough. Most of us want to get what we have coming to us. So the heavenly wisdom is submissive. It is full of mercy. It's full of good fruit. It's unwavering. Not unwavering in the sense of I won't compromise, but unwavering in the sense that you can always count on it to be like this. You can always count on it to be pure and peaceable and gentle. And it's without partiality, which reminds us of James 2, where the rich man comes into the synagogue and he's given a special seat. Wisdom from above doesn't show partiality because of a person's class or a person's race or a person's gender, how much money they have. That's not heavenly wisdom. That's earthly wisdom. Earthly wisdom says you need to pay special attention to the people who can help you, and to the people who have resources, and to the people who are going to give you the most pound for your buck. That's worldly wisdom. Earthly wisdom says to treat everyone the same. Well, James 4. James 4 continues this theme, as it were. So we have earthly wisdom and heavenly wisdom. James 4 begins to talk about the difference between friendship with the world and being friends with God. And so it says here in verse 4, do you not know that friendship with the world means hatred toward God? It doesn't give a lot of middle ground here. And of course, we're thinking about the sinful parts of the world, of course. It's not that James is a Gnostic. But James seems to depict conflicts among believers. I assume that he's talking about believers. He even mentions murder. I assume that there are no Christians that have murdered other Christians. But he says, what causes fights and quarrels among you? And since he's writing to the 12 tribes of Israel, but it doesn't feel like he's writing to Jews that aren't Christians. It just doesn't feel like he's writing to non-Christian Jews. That would be one interpretation, I suppose, to say that he's talking about quarrels between Christian Jews and non-Christian Jews. I just haven't seen that. Maybe I need to repent and change my interpretation. But basically, he speaks of fights and quarrels among believers because of desires they have that are warring against each other in their members, which reminds me of Paul's language about sin in some places. Maybe he's talking about also inside me, when I have different conflicting pleasures, different conflicting impulses and longings and cravings inside of me that are in war within me. That reminds me of the double-minded person of James 1. But he may mean conflicts between the longings and cravings of people within the church. Certainly that happens, right? All the churches in the world seem to have this phenomenon of factions and cliques within them. Not all of them, thankfully, but most of them. And so the church doesn't ask and they don't receive. Why don't they ask? Well, maybe the church deep down, the churches with these carnal, worldly desires, maybe they realize that God isn't going to give them those things. Maybe somewhere deep down they don't pray and ask for their longings and cravings because they know that those cravings and longings don't really fit with God. And James says when they do ask, they don't receive because they're asking according to their own pleasure, their own craving, their own longing. And so when we ask, when our hearts are aligned with God, and we ask in accordance with his will, we receive what we ask for, the Bible says. But of course, this isn't talking about, it's a catch-22. It's not, I want a car, and therefore I'm going to get it because I prayed for it. Our hearts have to be aligned with God, and if our hearts are aligned with God, then they're aligned with an attitude of submission. Not my will, but your will be done. But James talks to a church that isn't receiving what it asks because it's not asking for the right things. Its heart is not aligned with God. So this is an interesting picture. Friendship with the world is like having an affair on God. We are the bride of Christ, right? And so when we flirt with the world and its values and its pleasures, it's like flirting when we're the bride of Christ and we're married to God, and here we are flirting with the world. Interesting image. Don't want to take it too far, but there you have it. So then we have the last part, or kind of mid part of the chapter. Some great memory verses here. Submit to God, resist the devil, he'll flee from you. Come near to God, and he'll come near to you. Humble thyself in the sight of the Lord, and he will lift you up. And he will lift you up. May have had the tune wrong there, but you may have heard that chorus at some point. And then there's an interesting verse here. Wash your hands, you sinners, and purify your hearts, you're double-minded. Wash your hands, that is your sin acts. Make sure your sin acts stop and are cleansed. But then your heart shouldn't be double-minded either. Your intentions should be pure. Reminds us of the double-minded person in chapter 1. I've heard this preached in terms of entire sanctification. Cleanse your hands, have your sin acts cleansed. Purify your hearts, have your heart unified. That's not, of course, that goes beyond anything James says, but I think it'll still preach, even though it's not in the bubble above James's head exactly. But it's close. Humble yourselves, and he'll lift you up. Don't judge. So there's some material in this last part of James that remind us of the Sermon on the Mount. Maybe it's Jesus material. In Matthew 7, Jesus says, "Don't judge so that you're not judged." Now, of course, there is judging that happens in the New Testament. Paul says, the man who's sleeping with his father's wife, even though I'm not there, I've judged this person. There is some. So I think the difference is when you are taking God's place. I'm going well beyond James here, but especially when you judge other people's intentions. We can't see other people's intentions. Sometimes they're extenuating circumstances. But basically, there are times where we're in authority and we have to draw conclusions. I mean, it happens. When we're in a position of authority, God expects us to serve, to make conclusions. But I think we definitely want to err on the side of letting God take care of the judgment. There is judgment that takes place in the church, in the New Testament, to be sure. But we need to be careful to give the benefit of the doubt to others and to let God have the final say. This is definitely the side we want to err on rather than the other one. Hard passage number 3 on the rich. So James, I've said, has generally negative things to say toward the wealthy, especially the wealthy because they hoard their wealth. So we've had two passages on the rich so far. 1:10 talked about how that their flower was going to wither, and the poor were going to have their day. 2:2 talks about the rich man who comes into your synagogue. And now this is the hardest statement on the wealthy yet. Now he seems to be talking about merchants, somebody who says, I'm going to go such and such a place, I'm going to make money. Then I'm going to go to another place and I'm going to make money, that kind of a thing. Reminds me of the parable of the rich fool in Lazarus, the guy, in the book of Luke, where the rich fool says, wow, I've got so much grain, I'm going to tear down my current barns and I'm going to build bigger barns. And what does the parable say? You fool, do you not know that this day your life will be required of you? Which gives me to the previous bullet point. Don't be presumptuous about your future. Don't be arrogant to think that you're in control of your future or you can decide the future. Don't boast about where you're at, because ultimately God has a veto. Say the Lord willing. I had a grandfather who used to say this whenever he'd say he was going to do something, Lord willing. In Latin, Deo volente. The idea is don't presume that you can do anything unless the Lord allows you to do it. The Lord is sovereign. The Lord is in control. And so the best laid plans of men and women often fall. Remember, we can't do anything without the Lord's okay. The ancients, of course, had a problem with pride. We tend to consider pride very favorable today. have pride in yourself. Take pride in your work. This sort of thing. We're all about pride today. Not so in the biblical world. In the biblical world, the nail that stands up the highest is the first to get hit. I think it's a Chinese or Japanese proverb, maybe Japanese. But so you don't want to boast in the ancient world, because God might have to show you where your true place is. But don't presume about the future. James 4 ends with a partial definition of sin. And I really like this. This is an important verse for me as a Wesleyan. At the end of chapter 4. If anyone knows the good they ought to do and doesn't do it, that's sin. This is a description of what we might call a sin of omission. A sin of omission is when you know something you should have done, but you don't do it. You might know the story of Kitty Genovese in New York City, how 3 times she cried out for help while she was being mugged. And 3 times people turned on their lights in the nearby apartment complex, but didn't, her apartment complex, I guess, but they did nothing. They didn't call the police. She screamed, they turned on the lights, the screaming stopped, they turned off the lights, until finally she was dead. And so laws were passed, Kitty Genovese law, that basically says that not helping when you could is a crime as well. Certainly it's a sin. James says that if we know the good we ought to do and we don't do it, that's sin. Again, notice the intentionality of sin. Sin is not here accidental, but it involves a choice that we make. So James 5, the final chapter of James. James 5 begins with our 4th hard passage on the rich. This is the hardest in the whole letter. Weep and wail. Your wealth is going to rot. Don't hoard wealth. There was this sense that the ideal was most people lived off of a certain subsistence. Most people were subsistence livers in the ancient world. You earned just barely enough to get by, and maybe less because taxes and things. And so if somebody had wealth above that, they should give it to those who are in need. This is the general sentiment, I think, of the New Testament when it comes to resources. Those who hoard wealth, in this sense, are thought to be keeping it from other people. Now, I'm not making a direct comment on what we should do today in our culture, because our economy is different. I think these are the values. We want to err on this side. But I don't want to get into debates about is it better to teach a person how to fish or to give them a fish. Certainly, today, if they're hungry, we need to give them a fish. But I do agree that adjusting the structures of society, creating more just structures to where the water flows more evenly if water are the resources of society, a society where the water flows more evenly among all people, I think, is a more just society than one in which the water tends to flow in one direction. But again, economics are complicated, and sometimes when you try to solve a problem, you make it worse, or you enslave a person in other ways that they weren't enslaved before. And so I'm not going to comment on all the working out of how this plays out. But we need to sit a little uncomfortably, I think, with the book of James. We should let it. We shouldn't just say but. We should let it sink in a little here. And James seems to say, don't hoard wealth. John Wesley had a nice saying. I like this saying: earn all you can, save all you can, give all you can. The trick is that when he said save all you can, he didn't mean put it away in your 401k or in your bank account or in some trust fund. Save all you can meant buy the generic brand of Wheaties rather than Wheaties. In other words, as you spend money, get the cheapest deal that you can. Don't spend as much when you're getting things that you need to get. But I like this saying. It's not scripture, but I sure like it. I think it captures the tenor of scripture pretty well. Well, James 5 presumes that the wealthy cheat their workers. And of course, the nice thing about living in America is when capitalism was running amok in the late 1800s, all sorts of laws were passed, and in the early 1900s, laws were passed to try to control the natural sinful nature as it relates to money, to where a lot of the laws as it relates to capitalism are meant to make sure that it doesn't run amok to where in Upland Sinclair's novel The Jungle, there's a guy working in a factory who falls into a vat of leaf lard, and nobody even notices he's gone. He just dissolves and is packaged and sent out to the shelf. That seems to be a little bit of what the world was like in the late 1800s and early 1900s, before there were any regulations on an unbridled capitalism at that time. And so I would say that thankfully in America it doesn't have to be that way, and of course in other places. But James definitely presumes that the wealthy are cheating the workers. He doesn't even say, now some of you wealthy people cheat your workers. He just assumes that all wealthy people cheat workers here in the beginning of chapter 5. He gives an image of rich people who are fattening themselves for their own slaughter, which is a very interesting picture. They're eating and getting fat and fat and fat, but in the end, they're just going to be sacrificed. An allusion to the murder of Jesus is here. You've killed the righteous one, which suggests that James especially has the rich of the city of Jerusalem in mind here, I think. That he's thinking about people like the Sadducees and rich Pharisees. This is the second mention of Jesus also in verse, which verse is it? In verse 7. Be patient, brothers and sisters, until the Lord's coming. So this seems to be the second. Of course, Lord could refer to God the Father here, but I suspect it's a reference to Jesus. So we only really have two references. The death of Jesus. So you murdered the innocent one. So three references to Jesus in verse 6 here as well. Not a lot of mentions of Jesus. The harvest is coming, which I think is an allusion to the judgment that is coming. So James does have an eschatology. James does have a sense of the second coming and the judgment in history. James, again, this is a theme we've seen in this second section quite a bit. Don't grumble against each other. God is the judge. Remember the verses that said don't judge each other, don't grumble against each other. We need to be united as a church. The world wants to do enough abuse of us. Why would we abuse each other? Mentions of prophets and Job as examples of perseverance in a time of suffering. So here, as we close the book of James, we go back to that original statement in the book of James about consider it all joy when you fall into various trials. And here at the very ending of James, mention about persevering in the time of trials. The Lord is full of mercy. Don't swear. Let your yes be yes and your no be no. More Jesus tradition here that we find in the Sermon on the Mount. Of course, those of you who've just studied the book of Hebrews, now looking at James, will remember that God swears in the book of, not in terms of cussing, but in terms of taking oaths. And this is talking about oaths. We talked a little bit of this in class. If you want biblical teaching on curse words, you should look at Ephesians and Colossians 3. The third commandment isn't about cussing. Don't take the name of the Lord in vain. That's about oaths. And of course, in Hebrews, it's talking about God taking an oath, not God cussing. And of course, in James 3, it's talking about cursing others, not in cussing at them, but as in pronouncing bad ill wishes upon them. May you die. That's a curse of sorts. I'm not talking about anybody. I'm not cursing anybody. And of course, here again, it's talking about taking oaths here in James chapter 5. If someone is sick, call for the elders. We did this at College Church even just last week. Someone wanted to be anointed for an illness they have, and the elders got together and they were anointed and prayed for. So this is a tradition. It's not just a tradition, it works, of course, in the Lord's will. And so it's some practice that we should continue in the church. Interesting, if they have any sins, they will be forgiven. This is interesting because we forget that sometimes, not all the time, but sometimes in the Bible there is a connection made between sickness and sin. So Paul says in 1 Corinthians 11 about the Lord's Supper, there's some people who are abusing the Lord's Supper, and he says for some people died because of this, suggesting that their death was God's judgment on them, largely for the inequality between some of them getting drunk and gluttonously eating while others are hungry during the Lord's Supper. So nobody should stay away from the Lord's Supper because of that passage. It's talking about eating the Lord's Supper in an abusive kind of way that treats some people as better than others. But it implies that sometimes illness is associated with sin. Not always, but it can be. The energized prayer of a righteous person is very powerful. Here at the very end of James, we have the mention of Elijah. Remember how James prayed, turn on the rain, turn off the rain, or turn off the rain, turn on the rain? And the Lord heard Elijah's prayer. So the prayer of a righteous person is pretty powerful. And you may be a person like that. I've known people like that who, they're the people you want to pray for you when you're having a hard time. And so James says amen to that. And if somebody wanders, bring them back. Try to save them from death. We don't want don't just sit and watch a believer wander into the pit, fall into the abyss. If you see someone wandering, bring them back. Not because, oh good, I get to tell someone off. Again, the human nature is so sinister in the way it can take a good thing and twist it. It's not about, I'm going to go massage my own ego by helping a wanderer, but because I genuinely care for the destiny of someone, I'm going to try to bring them back. So there you have it, James 3 through 5.